In 2009, while Wall Street celebrated its bailout and America debated healthcare reform, China made a decision that would quietly rewrite the rules of global finance. No press conference, no declaration, just a series of currency swap agreements with countries most people had never heard of. You were taught that the dollar's dominance was permanent, that reserve currency status was something you earned once and kept forever. History says otherwise, and once you see what really happened, you can't unsee it. Welcome to the wealth timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because while everyone was watching stock tickers and unemployment numbers, China was building something far more consequential, an alternative to the system America had controlled for 70 years. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Every major commodity, oil, gold, grain, priced in dollars. Every international transaction settled through American banks. Every country needed dollar reserves to participate in global trade. This wasn't just economic convenience, it was structural power. When you control the currency the world uses, you control access to the system itself. You can freeze accounts, block transactions, impose sanctions that have the force of economic strangulation without firing a single shot. For 70 years, this arrangement seemed permanent. What no one noticed was that permanence required something specific, no credible alternative. The turning point came in stages, but the foundation was laid during the 2008 financial crisis. China watched as America's financial system, the system everyone depended on, collapsed under the weight of its own speculation. Lehman Brothers failed. AIG was hours from bankruptcy. The entire structure required trillions in emergency intervention to survive. And China, holding over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, suddenly understood its vulnerability. It wasn't a moral judgment, it was a calculation. If the global financial system ran through American institutions, and American institutions could fail, then any country dependent on that system was exposed. One banking crisis, one policy decision, one geopolitical conflict, and your access could be severed. Chinese economic planners began asking a question that would reshape the next 15 years. What would a parallel financial system look like? Not a replacement, not yet, just an alternative. A backup infrastructure that could operate independently if needed. It worked, but only if it remained quiet enough that no one tried to stop it. Between 2009 and 2015, China signed bilateral currency swap agreements with over 30 central banks: Argentina, Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates. The mechanism was simple. Two countries agreed to exchange currencies directly, bypassing the dollar entirely. Trade between them no longer required conversion through American banks or settlement through the SWIFT network. Each agreement was small, technical, the kind of monetary policy detail that doesn't make headlines, but the cumulative effect was structural. By 2013, China had launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, a direct alternative to SWIFT for Yuan-denominated transactions. By 2016, the International Monetary Fund had added the Yuan to its special drawing rights basket, granting it official reserve currency status alongside the dollar, euro, pound, and yen. Every step produced real benefits: reduced transaction costs for partner nations, faster settlement times, less exposure to dollar volatility. Each success created momentum for the next agreement. But there was an unintended consequence that few acknowledged. The more countries that joined this parallel network, the less leverage sanctions held. You can't freeze someone out of a system they no longer need to use. The stronger it became, the harder it was to stop. The first major test came in 2018. The United States reimposed sanctions on Iran, cutting it off from the dollar-based financial system. European nations, who wanted to maintain the Iran nuclear deal, found themselves unable to conduct basic trade with Tehran. Their banks, their companies, their governments, all dependent on dollar clearing, had no choice but to comply with American policy. China did not. Using Yuan-denominated transactions and the CIPS network, China continued purchasing Iranian oil. No dollar conversion, no American banks involved, no legal mechanism for Washington to block it. The transaction settled. The oil flowed. The precedent was set. What became clear was not that the dollar system had failed. It hadn't. What became clear was that it was no longer the only option. And in geopolitics, the existence of an alternative is often more important than its size. By 2020, roughly 20% of China's trade was settling in yuan. Saudi Arabia, America's longest-standing Middle Eastern ally, began discussing yuan-denominated oil sales. Russia, facing sanctions after Crimea, had already shifted its reserves away from dollars and into yuan, euros, and gold. Nothing collapsed, and that was the problem. If the shift had been dramatic, it would have triggered a response. But gradual erosion doesn't alarm, it accumulates. Each agreement felt reasonable in isolation. Each country had legitimate reasons for diversification, but the pattern was unmistakable. The architecture of dollar dependence was being quietly dismantled. The acceleration happened in 2022, but not because of China. When the United States and European Union froze Russian central bank reserves in response to the invasion of Ukraine, every finance ministry in the world took notice. Approximately $300 billion in assets, held in dollars and euros, rendered inaccessible by political decision. The action was legally justified under international law. The moral case was clear. But the precedent was terrifying. If reserves could be frozen for geopolitical reasons, then holding reserves was no longer just an economic decision, it was a political risk. Any nation with potential conflict on the horizon had to ask, could this happen to us? Within months, central banks across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America accelerated their de-dollarization efforts, not out of hostility to the United States, but out of institutional self-preservation. China's CIPS network saw transaction volume increase by 50% in a single year. The yuan's share of global payments reached its highest point since tracking began. Saudi Arabia formalized yuan acceptance for oil sales, the first major crack in the petrodollar system that had existed since 1974. The infrastructure China had spent 15 years building suddenly became essential. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. The dollar hasn't collapsed. It remains the world's dominant reserve currency, roughly 58% of global reserves as of 2024. But dominance is not the same as monopoly. What changed was optionality. Countries now negotiate with leverage they didn't have before. We can settle in yuan is not a threat, it's a fact. And facts reshape negotiations. The benefits accrued predictably. China reduced its vulnerability to external financial pressure. Partner nations gained flexibility in their monetary policy. Transaction costs fell for bilateral trade. But there were costs. The United States lost a degree of structural power it had held since Bretton Woods. Financial sanctions, once an unambiguous tool of foreign policy, became less effective against nations with access to alternative systems. The exorbitant privilege of printing the world's reserve currency began eroding at the margins. Power didn't transfer suddenly, it diffused, and diffusion is harder to reverse than collapse because there's no single point of failure to address. The system didn't break, it simply became less centralized. The shift was institutional, not ideological. Countries didn't choose the yuan because they preferred China's governance. They chose alternatives because alternatives reduced risk. In finance, that's called diversification. In geopolitics, it's called the end of unipolarity. We're living through a transition that won't be clear until it's already happened. The patterns are visible. In 1944, Britain's pound sterling was still considered a reserve currency. By 1976, Britain required an IMF bailout. The transition from dominance to dependence took one generation. Reserve currency status isn't granted forever. It's maintained through structural necessity. And when alternatives exist, necessity erodes. This isn't prediction. It's observation of what's already occurring. The yuan isn't replacing the dollar, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to provide enough optionality that dollar dominance becomes dollar plurality. History doesn't repeat events. It repeats incentives. And the incentive structure for a multipolar currency system is already in place. Two takeaways matter here. First, financial systems are only as permanent as the conditions that sustain them. When those conditions change, the system adapts, whether its architects want it to or not. Second, the most consequential changes in power happen quietly, not through war or revolution, but through infrastructure, agreements, and alternatives that seem technical until suddenly they're structural. Because in the world of wealth and power, history never ends. It just changes hands. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself.